Hi,
And
everybody. My name is Natalie. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm one of the co-owners and managing directors with Impetus Digital. I'm also the Toronto lead for the Transformative technology community. For those of you who don't know what Impetus Digital does, is our company has built some of the best in class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration tools to allow our clients, which are pharmaceutical, medical device, biotech, life science companies, and healthcare companies, interact virtually with their stakeholders, be it patients, payers, physicians, allied healthcare providers. We help them to virtualize things like advisory boards, working groups, helping them do things like medical education and training for their sales reps and MSLs, et cetera. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from those conversations come big, hairy, audacious, bleeding edge things that we can create and co-create together so that we can truly, collectively, positively disrupt healthcare. So one of the things that we're actually trying to do is start a courageous conversation and starting a masterclass on how to implement systems innovations as applies to big, systematic, holistic questions, queries, and issues and challenges. Not necessarily for healthcare per se, but just in general, and how to apply systems, innovations, thinking in everything that we do. Today is session 5. We've actually run several different sessions. I encourage you to go into our YouTube channel to take a look at session 1 to 4 so you can get some of the background in case this is the first time you're listening in. But today we're going to be talking about the iceberg model and leveraging and considering the different points in the iceberg model for helping to solve some of these big, hairy, audacious, complex questions. So as I'm going to talk about, first of all, is what is the iceberg model and how does this apply to systems change? So as the old cliche goes, is that the tip of the iceberg is really barely what we can conceive as being the main issue or the main problem. What we are normally looking at when we're taking a look at the top of the iceberg are really what we call events. So some of the key things that have been going on recently, of course, since COVID-19, is the myriad of events that we've seen transform our lives and have accelerated change. Everything from the use of like telemedicine to virtualizing how patients and payers and physicians interact, to some of the social unrest that we have seen, a lot of the policing issues, the health economics, all of these different myriad of things are events. We're looking at the very top line of what is going on around us. So that's really the tip of the iceberg. And so what we see about the tip of the iceberg is we're really just looking at we're observing, we're looking at these things, and we're looking at things like statistics, and we're just doing a general observation. The next level down, as we go under the water of this typical iceberg, which, as you know, is a gigantic behemoth, which is really a great metaphor for these big complex issues that we are surrounded by, is the idea around patterns. So behind every event, if we look at enough events statistically, we can see that there's some sort of a pattern. And again, as I was mentioning earlier, these patterns can be developed into statistics. So if we look at the COVID-19 example, we can see that we've started to create demographics and start being able to educate ourselves in certain geographical pockets and certain types of individuals, either age or health factors, gender specifications that might put you into what we call higher risk versus low risk. We've seen this as an example as we've been evaluating the health of Donald Trump, as he has recently been diagnosed with COVID-19, and the fact that he is, rather obese, he's a man, and he's over the age of 65, puts him in a higher risk category. So as soon as we take a look at the fact of the event, which was President Donald Trump got COVID-19, i.e. this is an event, this is the tip of the iceberg, when we dig deeper and we start looking at structure, then we start to look at the patterns. We start looking at who and how he actually derived COVID-19, and statistically, what puts him in greater or less risk, and how this, of course, is going to impact the overall economy and the state of affairs and security in the US. But further to that, we also have to realize that there's other components to this as well. And that's really the next piece in the iceberg model, which is really looking at the structure. So when we look at the structure, we're looking at things like norms, policies, guidelines, the things that surrounded President Trump and how he contracted COVID-19 all play out to this idea of policies, procedures, and standards of practice. We've heard a lot about the recent party that happened over in Washington, where there was a lot of people interacting and mingling without masks. That is considered a process or a protocol or a methodology that resulted in a pattern of a whole slew of people who were in that particular pathway, or these super spreaders, of why several people in the government contracted COVID-19, and then taking us up to the events of seeing all these people suddenly being diagnosed. So we're working up the echelon from structure to patterns to events. And certainly we can say that this actually transposes in so many other things in the COVID-19 pandemic beyond the presidential and the president and the government. So everything from certain jurisdictions applying successfully or unsuccessfully, things like contact tracing apps, and how people have been successful in managing and sequestering and getting people to follow guidelines and staying home. We see this across the globe, everything from Australia, where people were literally in lockdown for days, if not weeks, to other jurisdictions having it fairly open and kids going to school and being open with businesses and bars, but just having them close early. And then being able to then determine from that, what were the patterns? What were the patterns of contraction of the COVID-19, the patterns in the numbers of cases versus the amount of testing that was going on versus the number of hospitalizations, deaths, et cetera. So they all kind of move up the echelon, if you will, of the iceberg model. And last but not least, the very bottom of all of this, the thing that really pushes everything to the top of the iceberg model is our mental models. In other words, it's our belief systems, it's what we believe to be our values, our assumptions, and what our truth values are. Now, this one is actually a lot more difficult to derive and to change, because a lot of us are not even aware that we have these general heuristics. And these are what I call mental shortcuts, or areas of belief systems, and how we have basically the old Hebbian law, whatever fires together wires together, which is the neural networks in our brain. And so what's really important here is we have a very energy efficient brain and a mind in terms of the cognitive neurosciences and the way our brain works. Is we always look for the easy way to define, to derive meaning, to pick and choose through ways of convergence and divergent thinking, to be able to plug and play so that we can relate new things that we're being faced with what we already know. And that's what we call by heuristics or mental shortcuts. Daniel Kahneman wrote a lot about this in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So what happens here is we create belief systems. And then what we do is we oftentimes, because we don't like to live in cognitive dissonance, we will usually seek to do what we call confirmational bias. We will pick and choose the event structures and the design of things around us to be able to either refute or to confirm our bias or our opinion. So that way we can get into a good feeling place that we are confirming what we already believe to be true. So what the first and foremost that we have to do is we have to ask the important questions about what is our values and beliefs. And that from that very core structure, and then this example I'm showing is what is our belief around masks, around COVID-19, and making sure that we're covering our face, and doing other things like washing our hands, doing social distancing, staying apart from family during things like Thanksgiving and upcoming events and family festivities, is what is truly our belief system around that. And fundamentally, do we believe that COVID-19 is truly a pandemic? Do we truly believe, or is there other beliefs that we have that there's a conspiracy theory, that it's not really happening, or that it's not as bad as we believe? And that signals, for example, the mask, which is really is a metaphor of those beliefs, becomes weaponized. And unfortunately, it becomes very political, and it becomes a political tool and a political symbol. So it's really important as we look at these various echelons or layers, that if we were to simply take a look at the COVID-19 from simply the events, which really, as you know, at the news level is all we ever really do, is we're reporting on the latest contraction, the latest numbers of hospitalizations or number of cases, and that's as far as we take it. It's just the news is just reporting the events. We can't change the world. We can't change COVID-19. We can't change other big, hairy, audacious healthcare, economic, social issues at the event level. If we did, what we'll find is that the heavy iceberg, the things that are coming right from the bottom, which is our mental models and our structures and our patterns, will simply push the iceberg up again, and we will just simply see a different derivation of events. So what we really have to do is we need to dig deeper. We need to get to the bare bones and to what we call the the really reasons, or the root cause, if you will, of all of these issues. So if we're simply looking at the idea as simple as catching a cold, if I was to actually say to you, what was the event? Well, I was sniffling, here was my signs, my symptoms, I had a bad cough. That is really rendering the event of having a cold. But then if we were to dig deeper in the iceberg model, under the pattern, we'd sort of say, okay, well, what is causing this cold? And we would get the individual to start looking around and analyzing what they've been doing recently. And they can actually suggest that looking at patterns of their sleep, of what they've been doing at work, they can simply suggest, well, I've been feeling really tired lately. And this has actually become a pattern for me of feeling really tired and run down, and hence the reason for the event of catching the cold. If we dig even further down the pipe, down the iceberg, and we look at the structural level of this, as we can see, we can ask the question about, well, why have you been feeling so tired? And we would get the individual be asking those questions again and finding out that they were doing everything from heavy work schedules, that there has been a huge demand at work recently because some things have been going on, or there's been, with the COVID, they might be managing a team and there's a lot of stress, or they could be in the healthcare space. Maybe there's a frontline worker and they have just been having undue demands on their time. So work deadlines at a structural level has caused a pattern of feeling really tired, which has caused the event of catching a cold. And last but not least, if we get to the real core crux of all of this, which is the mental models, is one has to ask the question about, why has the work deadlines been so insane? Or why have you been working so hard? And one can actually fundamentally get, this is almost like the 5 questions, if anybody's ever heard of that pattern, is whenever you want to get to the root cause of something, to ask the question 5 times. So continue to ask why, 5 times. This is like this is a metaphorical version of the 5 whys using this iceberg model. So if we get down to that core tenet of, why have you been having such heavy work deadlines? Why have you been working so hard? You could potentially find out that a core belief that this individual has is maybe because they feel that if they don't work those heavy deadlines, that they may lose their job, or they may be outcompeted for a job promotion, or they just may fundamentally believe that they are a pivotal tool in a really important intervention in overall health for millions of people, or hundreds of people that they might be working in their hospitals. So there's some really core fundamental belief systems that are leading to the eventual event of them catching a cold. So what's really important here, as I was mentioning, is when we look at this iceberg model, is we need to understand what the root causes are. So when we're evaluating the event, we realize that where we are reacting to a series of things going on in the world that we're observing. When we get down to the next level of the pattern, we find that when we can understand things at a pattern level, when we start understanding statistics, when we start understanding how people are aligning, or we start noticing, for example, in the COVID-19 example, that there's large congregations going on, or house parties, or car rallies, we can start anticipating the event of people contracting COVID-19. So that would be an example of anticipation when we look at and understand the patterns. When we dig even further and we have a better clarity and understanding and recognition of the structures behind these patterns, we can start redesigning how we do things. So if we start realizing that there's a pattern associated with young kids getting together in car rallies or house parties without really a care in the world or feeling like they're immune or they're not going to get it, is we can start redesigning promotional messages. The methods at which, and the words and the positioning and the mechanisms of communicating at a deep psychological level that young people would understand. Similarly, looking at structures around people wearing masks or not. So instead of having demotivating and threatening and very totalitarian rules and regulations, finding out ways that people can emotionally connect. So that would be an example of designing new structures. And last but not least, getting really further down the iceberg, and when we really get a keen understanding of what is happening to people psychologically, what mental models, do they have certain beliefs about conspiracy theories? Do they feel safe? Do they feel secure? Once we have those ideas, we can truly start to transform the way that we are collectively managing, monitoring, sustaining the health of our populations, being able to get through and flatten the curve with COVID-19, helping our populations, helping our healthcare systems so they're not getting throttled with tons of hospitalizations, protecting our vulnerable and our frontline workers and everybody else, whilst at the same time trying to manage the economy and being able to get through this. So transformational thinking around the psychology and the mental models and the belief systems around what do people really believe to be important? What is that sweet spot between economic viability and the healthcare of millions, and trying to find that place where you can get the largest amount of consensus and people building on that belief system. So working at the transformational level is really what's going to get us beyond these major issues like the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm just going to use another concrete example here. We've recently seen, amidst all the other havoc that's been going on around this incredible year of 2020, is around things like our justice and our criminal justice. We've been seeing all kinds of things recently around Black Lives Matter. We've seen issues around police brutality and protests going on, fires, anarchy, looting, peaceful or not. We've seen all kinds of sanctions and different groups coming up from all sorts of different areas across the globe, coming up to protest their concerns around social injustice, inequality, brutality, and the justice system. So excavating this a little bit further is I just wanted to kind of piece this together and linger on a little bit of a case study and then asking some questions. So what we actually know today, and this is just a really focused description of what's happening in the US, specifically in New York, is we realize that there's about 10 million people currently in the US who are incarcerated. That is a gigantic piece of the population. But what we also know from a cost and economic standpoint is that in a typical average New York penitentiary, it costs on average $2,500 a night or $900,000 a year for an inmate to stay in a prison. Now, if you actually to compare that to the cost, for example, of a one night in a Hilton or in an extremely expensive hotel, you'd be remiss to get as close. You probably wouldn't be spending maybe more than $700 to $900, and that's a really expensive hotel. So the amount of money that's being spent on incarceration is gigantic. And what's important also to add to this economic evaluation is that the average New York citizen is spending in their taxes over $2,000 a year just to help maintain the state prison system. And that is a gigantic percentage of the average taxes that an average citizen in New York is paying. So what we do find is that the cost of crime equals about $700 billion a year, and that was in 2017, of which $200 billion were really just to maintain prisons across the US. So these are staggering numbers. And what we also have to do when we're evaluating the economics behind social unrest, the prison system, which is a very large percentage of the criminal justice system, is there's three various costs. The first one is really the cost of anticipation, the anticipation of crime. And with that, we're actually paying all kinds of things as citizens, as states, as provinces, various jurisdictions and governments on things like insurance. We're paying for things like home security systems and prevention programs, policing and prisons. To the next level of cost, we're looking at the cost of consequence. So after the crime has actually taken place, what are the costs associated with things like property damage? There's going to be financial loss for a whole slew of different people, lost wages for individuals who might have been harmed or potentially even killed in some of these crimes. And of course, with that is going to be a decrease in these affected persons' work productivity. So insurance companies and employers are also equally affected because of the insurance and the other sorts of things they have to pay for as well in terms of short, long-term disability, life insurance, etc. And last but not least, the cost associated with this criminal justice system and the way we look at crime is really the cost of how we respond to these crimes. And that is everything from our courts and legal systems to the investigations that have to take place, policing, prisons. Again, insurance comes up as well as repairs. So insurance seems to be coming up in all three pillars around the costs. And it does actually make one ask the question, this is sort of a conspiracy theory concept, of the criminal system's labor revenue. You're talking about a huge onslaught or a huge number of people that are currently incarcerated. And part of the incarceration is that these individuals do work. It's part of the plan. And a lot of them are working for close to being free. So this is free labor revenue. And what's even more startling and concerning is that this labor revenue is actually held and contained within private organizations that are that maintain these jail systems. So there is some concern overall in the jailing and in this overall policing, you know, who's got dibs on this? Is this is being heralded by and managed or pursued or lobbied by insurance companies to keep people incarcerated so that we can get free labor? It feeds back into these private jail systems, and then sort of the loop continues on and keeping these individuals out of society. So lots of queries, lots of conspiracy theories, lots of questions and concerns around costs, basically what we're calling the cost-benefit analysis. Ultimately, everything comes down to numbers. So it's the cost of keeping people incarcerated versus the benefit of keeping them incarcerated. So looking at costs of the jail systems, all those other things, the cost of consequence, of anticipation, and the actual crimes themselves versus the costs associated with insurance and all those other things. And then really the benefit around free labor, being able to get all kinds of things done and being able to move that money back into private systems. So really interesting concept to discuss. So leaving this actually for some group discussion, and really looking at the ideas of, you know, parsing this as part of the Iceberg model and looking at those various leverage points, starting off with evaluating crime at an event level. So what are some of the recent events that we've been observing in our criminal justice system that would be considered an event? And so I was already alluding to some of this, which is a lot of the protests that have been going on, rioting, you know, Black Lives Matter, other supremacist groups coming up and having their say, all kinds of different groups coming up. These would be what we call events. These are things that are being broadcasted in the news, and it's what we're observing as a society. And then the question comes down to is an opportunity is how are we reacting to these events? And so equally there's actually major concerns, and there's a lot of fear and insecurity. You're seeing a huge division in jurisdictions, cities, states, provinces across the globe, and you're seeing almost like a weaponization of these issues, and is becoming a very political play of what side you are on, and it's becoming a very divisive set of topics and events. The next piece on the iceberg level is talking about the patterns. So what kind of recurrent patterns are we observing in our criminal justice system that's causing these events to take place? And so one of the things that we can say is that we are noticing that there is a lot of inequality. We're noticing that certain genders, certain certain people of color, all sorts of other ways that they're seeing this inequality in work environment. We've seen actually a division between what is happening in Wall Street versus Main Street, with the stock market going through the roof regardless of the unemployment rate, and a huge impact on people in the service and retail industry. So we're noticing some of these patterns. We're noticing that there's some inequality on how crimes are being managed, with George Floyd and a whole series of other things that have been going down the pike, with injustices, and comparing it to other groups of people if they were to do similar types of crimes, how they were managed, with examples of those. So those would be some of the patterns that we are noticing that are causing the events of today. And so how is society actually anticipating these patterns? So one of the things that we can start doing is, if we start to see certain jurisdictions, certain populations congregating, we start to look at patterns, for example, in social media, when we see people gathering. This is one of the reasons that we're putting a lot of focus on pattern and social media patterning, and a lot of concern on Twitter, Facebook, and other social media sites, because these can be weaponized and leveraged to bring an uprising or a new group or something terrible to happen in terms of patterns and then these social unrest events. As we move down the iceberg model into the structural space, we have to ask again about what do we notice as being some of the rules of the game in the forms of policy and guidelines that are causing some of these patterns. And as we've mentioned earlier, we're starting to see that there is a lot going on, not necessarily legislated, but we notice that there's not a lot of women, for example, on boards of directors, or people of color, or there isn't the same number of venture funds or fundraising for people of color, for example, entrepreneurs. And so we're noticing that there's a lot of rules of the game, either written or not, that have to be acknowledged, that we're noticing that why people are actually doing some of these uprisings and these patterns. We'll also notice that there's these patterns that are geographical patterns, that there might be patterns in inner cities versus suburban areas. And there can be certain areas, within certain states versus others. And so creating those patterns and ideas based on some of the regulations, legislation, belief systems in those particular areas that are causing those uprisings and those events to take place. So then the question comes down to is, what are we doing to redesign these structures? We saw several months ago, a lot of tech companies were starting to try to do some of this by, for example, stepping down out of their board positions at some of these high tech companies to leave space and room for somebody else, perhaps a person of color, to take on a board position. We've seen some new funds and new monies coming, for example, in Canada, for people of color being able to put money towards entrepreneurship and other small businesses that a lot of these individuals wouldn't normally have access to. So these are some of the redesigns of the legislation, norms, guidelines that we're trying to reinforce and change so that we can affect some of these patterning, and these people not necessarily feeling the need to rally and to protest and to cause all kinds of crimes and looting and all kinds of other things that people end up getting incarcerated for. Uprisings are not the only reason people are getting incarcerated. It's a lot of times because they're just feeling the injustices of not being able to meet financial demands, not being able to have access to certain jobs. And that actually takes us to the next thing around mental models. So as we look at the very bottom layer of the iceberg, and we take a look at the leverage point here, is the belief systems that are truly causing these policies, these norms, these patterns, and these events from taking place. We have to dig really deep into the fiber of the belief systems around prejudice, bias, what we really believe somebody's abilities, are they able to perform in the workforce? Do we believe that certain people can't perform at certain levels, that they can't be entrepreneurs? And is that the reason that we're not selecting them? Do we have belief systems that if we select certain people of color that they're going to cause problems in our organization, or you know, and what does that look like? And so all of these things fundamentally prevent individuals from being able to attain certain financial status, abilities, and so crime can result. Because again, we're faced with social media. We see a lot of the haves versus have-nots. Certainly the have-nots are always asked the question of, why not me? So these are really important things as we dig further down and understanding what we can do to transform these mental models. I've already given some examples of things that are going on at a governmental and policy level, but even within the individuals, ourselves, getting into some cognitive dissonance with our own personal belief systems around what we think about certain people that look and act differently than us. Be people in our own office that have conflicting opinions. We've actually seen this more than ever before as we look and move forward towards a presidential election very, very shortly. Never before have we been confronted, because of the complete access to social media and opinions, to such a variance in various what I call root truths or points of truth or senses of reality. So many people are trying to navigate this idea of sense making and meaning making by being able to take the narrative of what we're all telling each other, pulling it into small propositions, and being able to dissect them almost like a virtual Wikipedia, but in our belief systems. Sense making has never been more difficult than it is today because of the sheer number of realities that we're all putting out to the world. It doesn't mean that my reality or my sense of truth is better, grander, or more truer than yours. It's really the immensity of the possibility that your reality could be just as true for you as mine is to me. And with that knowledge comes an unmistakable concern that we can actually hit anarchy, because nobody's truth is more truthful than somebody else's. And we have to actually come to a consensus of what we believe to be more true than not. And that's really ultimately what politics is all about. And really what the criminal justice system is trying to lock in is saying is shut-ins are the people that are contrary to this consensus of reality. And the shut-outs are the people outside of that issue, or the incarceration or the criminal justice system, are the people who adhere to the overarching society's belief systems of what we believe to be true. So the transformation of these models, of being able to expand the periphery of what we believe to be true, to be able to truly be inclusive of the myriad or the fractals of reality that can coexist, is what's going to be transformative for all of us in this unprecedented time of change and opportunity. So again, I think I just want to leave with this, is that we need to really dig deeper in the iceberg model, getting beyond the events and even the patterns of what we see statistically, getting deep into the structure and the mental models, our belief systems, our values, our virtues, so that we can really, truly, positively disrupt all of these complex issues that are hitting us at a crazy speed today. So some of the homework for you to be thinking about is really taking a look at the iceberg model as it applies to a particular problem that you are vested in or interested in, either in society or in your life personally. So asking yourself the question of what wicked problem is being exposed in society today? And then what component of this wicked problem is just showing up as events? What are you just noticing and observing? What are you hearing being blared on social media and on the news? But then also asking yourself to dig deeper. What components are lying below that tip of the iceberg? What are you noticing in terms of patterns? What is underlying those patterns in terms of general structures, policies, norms? And below all of that, what is the bias? What are the mental models? What have we built in terms of our brain neural circuitry around these? And last but not least, asking yourself what systemic approaches can be utilized to create profound change at all of these levels through anticipation, redesigning, and transforming what we are currently seeing. So with all of that said, I do want to let you know that our 6th session is going to be taking place on Wednesday, November 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We are going to be talking about systems and stakeholder analyses. For those of you who may be interested, you can join our Facebook group. It's called Systems Innovation for Transformative Technology Community. I urge you to join the private group. You'll see that we'll have videos as well as the slides for this discussion. Love to get your feedback, so please feel free to leave those in the notes below or in our Facebook page. So thank you to all of you who are attending today, and wishing you all a wonderful day ahead.